The tray hit the floor before I could even reach for it. I heard the clatter first, then the wet sound of synth protein paste spreading across the polished deck. Then the laughter, 5 voices, each one carrying that specific pitch of cruelty that does not need a translator to understand. I had been at Galactic Fleet Academy for exactly 47 days, and I already knew that sound by heart. My name is Marcus Vale. I am 22 years old. I grew up in a town called Carlisle in the north of England, where it rained most of the year, and people learned early not to complain about the cold. I joined the Terran Defense Corps when I was 17, served 2 active tours along the Martian perimeter, and came home with a commendation, a slightly crooked nose, and a very particular understanding of what it felt like when someone decided you were not worth respecting. Standing in the cafeteria of Orbital Station Aurelis, 300,000 kilometers above a planet I could not pronounce the name of, staring at a month's worth of carefully saved meal credits slowly soaking into a floor drain, I felt that understanding settle back into my bones like an old familiar ache. The cafeteria aboard Aurelis was enormous. It occupied the entire third ring of the station's rotating habitation wheel, curved in a long arc with transparent panels along one wall that looked out into open space. At any given meal cycle, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 cadets from roughly 40 different species ate here. Some of them breathed a different atmosphere and sat behind sealed partition screens. Some of them ate things that would dissolve a human stomach in about 30 seconds. Most of them sat in clusters with their own kind and kept a careful distance from everyone else. Humans, as a category, were rare. I knew of 2 others on the station. Lieutenant Cadet Owen Marsh, who was doing an engineering specialization on the far side of the wheel, and who I saw maybe once a week, and Cadet Nina Collier, a xenobiology student from Leeds who always looked vaguely overwhelmed and slightly sunburned despite being in space. Neither of them was in the cafeteria that afternoon. I was alone at a table near the outer wall, which was where I preferred to sit. Good view of the stars, back to a solid surface, clear sight lines to both exits, old habits. I had just finished a long morning in Commander Illith's Tactical Response Seminar. 3 hours of pressure scenarios projected in full sensory simulation that left my head feeling like it had been gently squeezed. And I was hungry in the particular sharp way that only real mental exhaustion produces. The tray I had spent 15 minutes carefully assembling from the human-compatible food station included a portion of reconstituted grain, a protein block that smelled approximately like chicken if you did not think too hard about it, and a small container of something advertised as apple juice that tasted mostly like sweetened water with ambitions. It was not a remarkable meal. It was my meal, and someone had just knocked it onto the floor. I looked down at the mess, then I looked up. The Vrethkai are not small creatures. They stand between 7 and 8 feet tall on their rear walking limbs, with a forward-leaning posture that puts their upper body at roughly human eye level. Their exoskeleton is a deep blue-green, almost iridescent under artificial light. They have 4 upper limbs, 2 primary arms with heavy articulated claws, and 2 secondary manipulator arms that are thinner and faster. Their heads are angular, with compound eyes that take in a wide lateral field of vision, and their mouths have 3 separate sets of smaller mandibles arranged around a central biting structure. They are, by any honest measure, intimidating to look at. These 5 were third-year cadets, all male, from what I understood of Vrethkai gender structure, all large even by the standards of their own species. One of them, the tallest, wore the shoulder marking of a unit leader, which in academy terms meant he had political standing as well as physical presence. His name, as I had learned over the past several weeks of watching this particular group occupy their territory in the cafeteria, was Vrek. The others I knew only by their positions in his orbit, the 2 who flanked him closest, and the 2 slightly smaller ones who laughed the loudest and always moved a half-second after he did. Vrek was looking at me with the particular expression of someone who has done something and found the result satisfying. One of his secondary arms was still extended from the casual sweep that had cleared my tray off the edge of my table as he walked past. He had not even fully stopped walking. It had been deliberate, casual, and completely certain of itself. I had watched these 5 for several weeks. In that time, I had seen them move through the cafeteria like they owned it, which in a social sense they did. I had seen them interrupt smaller cadets mid-meal, take the better tables without asking, and make a very specific comment in Galactic Common, the shared trading language of the Compact, that was designed to travel just far enough to sting. They had done things to other cadets that I had noted and filed away. A Selly student whose food was rearranged while she was getting her drink. A Thurvian first year whose homework pad ended up under a bench. Small things, deliberate things. The language of people who enjoy reminding others of their position. They had been working up to me for a while. I had known it was coming. I had simply not decided yet what I was going to do about it. I sat very still and looked at my empty tray on the floor. There is a thing that happens in the human body when a threat appears. Most species in the Galactic Compact know about it in a general way because it is documented in the xenobiology files under the heading of adrenal cortisol stress cascade. What the files do not fully capture is the texture of it from the inside. The way time does not slow down exactly, but becomes more detailed. The way peripheral sounds sharpen. The way your hands, if you have spent enough time training them, do not shake. They settle. My hands settled on the table in front of me. I breathed in through my nose, slowly and all the way. Vrek took one step toward my table. He was looking at me with compound eyes that caught the light in shifting patterns of green and gold. Around us, the cafeteria noise had dropped, not to silence but to a lower register. Other cadets noticed without looking directly. The energy in the room had changed. Everyone in that space, regardless of species, knew the pattern of what this was. He spoke, not in the standard galactic common that was used in class and official settings, but in a rougher dialect of it, one with a specific edge to certain words. My translator implant, a small device behind my left ear, standard issue for all Academy cadets, rendered it clearly enough. He said something about the food being appropriate for my category of creature. He used a word for humans that I had heard twice before in my weeks on the station and had quietly looked up. It was not a good word. Then he reached out one large primary claw and placed it on my right shoulder, not hard, not a strike, a placement. Ownership expressed through casual physical contact, which is one of the oldest ways any creature in any part of the universe has ever communicated that you belong beneath them. I looked at the claw on my shoulder. I looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then I looked up at Vrek and I smiled. I do not know exactly what Vrek expected at that moment. Perhaps he expected me to look away. Perhaps he expected the particular combination of apology and submission that I had seen other cadets produce in this situation. The lowered posture and the quiet backing down that was the socially efficient response. Perhaps, if he had thought about it at all, he expected that a human, soft, small, no claws, no exoskeleton, no special sensory capabilities, a provisional member species from a third-rate planet that had only been off its own rock for 60 years, would simply absorb the moment and walk away. He had his claw on my shoulder and 5 of his friends around him and the weight of social territory behind him, and I was smiling. I want to be honest about the smile, because it was not a happy expression. It was the kind of smile that happens when a part of you that is very old and very practiced recognizes a situation it has been in before and knows, with complete calm, exactly what comes next. My mother would have recognized that smile. My old commanding officer, Captain Felix Horn, would have recognized it too. He had told me once, very quietly, after a particular incident on the Martian perimeter that I will not go into here, that the most dangerous thing about me was not my training. It was the fact that I never looked dangerous until I was already done. Vrek did not know Captain Felix Horn's assessment. He was about to receive a practical demonstration of it. The cafeteria around us was almost quiet now. Somewhere behind me, near the wall of observation panels, I was aware of a small figure, a Selly cadet, maybe second year, barely 4 feet tall, pale blue skin, large dark eyes, who had her personal recording device out and was holding it in slightly trembling hands pointed in my direction. She had been sitting 2 tables away from me. I did not know her name yet. I would learn it later. She was the only one who did not look away. I took my eyes off Vrek's claw, looked back at his face and said, very quietly, in clear galactic common, "You are going to want to move that." He did not move it. He tilted his head at an angle that in Vrethkai body language communicated something between amusement and dismissal. And then I moved. There is a concept in human hand-to-hand fighting tradition that most other species in the compact do not immediately grasp. It comes from a very long history of human beings fighting other human beings, which is something humans did with extraordinary creativity and commitment for most of their recorded existence. That history produced, across dozens of cultures and thousands of years, a deep and detailed understanding of the vulnerabilities of the human body. And because humans all share the same basic architecture, that knowledge was endlessly tested and refined and passed down and improved. When humans began encountering other species, many of those in the compact assumed that human fighting techniques would become obsolete. After all, a Vrethkai is larger, heavier, and structurally armored. A Driven has reflexes roughly twice as fast as a human. A Thurvian can exert crushing force with its secondary limbs that no human could match. On paper, in a direct contest of raw physical capability, humans lose almost every comparison. What the paper does not account for is adaptability. I had spent 3 weeks studying the publicly available xenobiology and anatomy files on every species at the Academy, not because I was planning anything. It is simply what I do when I am somewhere new and surrounded by unknowns. I read, I observe, I file information away. It is the same thing I did in every new posting in the Terran Defense Corps, and it had kept me alive and intact through situations that had not been gentle. I knew, for example, that the Vrethkai exoskeleton is thickest across the dorsal surface and the front chest plate. It is designed for forward-facing threats. The lateral joint connections, particularly at the second and fourth limb articulations, are covered by a thinner chitinous membrane that allows movement range but provides significantly less structural protection. I knew that their compound eyes, while offering wide-angle vision, have a processing lag when tracking objects that change direction quickly at close range. I knew that their primary claws, while powerful, require a wind-up motion of approximately 0.4 seconds to deliver full-force impact because the muscles driving them are built for sustained grip strength, not fast extension. I knew all of this the way a carpenter knows where wood is likely to split, not with malice, just with knowledge. 10 seconds is a long time when you know what you are doing. The first second, I pushed back from the table with my left foot, creating just enough space. Vrek's claw came with me. He had not released it, which pulled his balance fractionally forward. That fraction was enough. Second and third seconds, I turned inside his reach rather than away from it, which is the counterintuitive move that most opponents do not anticipate, because the instinct is to create distance. Close distance means his claw has no leverage. I was now beside him, inside the arc of his primary arms. His secondary manipulator arms were faster, but smaller, and reaching for me from the wrong angle. Fourth second. The lateral joint on his second left limb is located approximately where a human elbow would be. If a human elbow bent both ways, a sharp short impact there does not break anything. It sends a nerve signal that causes involuntary limb retraction. His left primary arm folded inward. He made a sound. Fifth second. The first flanking Vrethkai, the larger of the two who stood closest to Vrek, moved toward me. He moved from my right side, which was where he had been standing. I was already turning. His reaching motion carried his center of mass forward. I helped it along. The floor is very good at stopping things. 6th and 7th seconds. The second flanker had better instincts and came in lower. But lower, for a Vrethkai, means leading with the head, and the head has a triangular ridge above the primary eye cluster that, when introduced to a downward forearm strike, delivered with the full rotation of the human torso, produces a result documented in the xenobiology files under the heading of disorientation cascade. He sat down, not aggressively, he just sat down, like the decision to stand had become temporarily too complicated. 8th second. The third Vrethkai, one of the smaller two, had backed away. He was not a coward. He was simply processing. The fourth one tried to use that moment to come around behind me. I was already stepping sideways. 9th second. Vrek himself had recovered his balance and swung. It was a large swing. Large swings have a predictable geometry. I was not inside that geometry when it arrived. 10th second. I was standing 2 steps away from where I had started. All 5 of them were on the floor, or against the table in various configurations that were not comfortable, but were not permanently harmful. I knew exactly how much force I had used. Not more than necessary. The goal is never permanent damage. The goal is a clear and immediate communication. The cafeteria was completely silent. I looked at the 5 of them for a moment. Then I walked to the food counter, picked up a new tray, and went back to my table. Somewhere behind me, I heard the quiet sound of a recording device being lowered. I glanced over. The small Selly cadet was still there, perfectly still, dark eyes very wide. Her hands were no longer shaking. She was looking at me with an expression I could not fully read at the time, but would later understand as something between disbelief and a very specific kind of relief. I gave her a small nod. Then I sat down, opened my new container of mostly water apple juice, and started eating. The stars outside the observation panel were exactly where they had been before. The rotation of the station wheel continued at its steady pace. 300,000 kilometers below, the unnamed planet I could not pronounce turned quietly in the dark. 47 days into my time at the Galactic Fleet Academy, in a cafeteria that smelled of 100 different foods from 100 different worlds, I had just taught 5 cadets a lesson that no classroom on this station had scheduled. They lay on the floor. I drank my juice. It tasted like sweetened water with ambitions. But that afternoon, it was good enough. The next 18 hours were very quiet in a way that felt like the moment before a large wave arrives on a shore you are standing too close to. I went to my quarters after the meal. My room was a standard-issue cadet berth on the 7th ring, a rectangular space with a bunk, a desk, a sealed environment locker for gear, and a narrow viewport that faced the outer edge of the station. The viewport was not large enough to see much, just a strip of stars and the slow drift of the station's rotation carrying the same patch of sky across my window every 42 minutes. I had measured it in my first week because I was having trouble sleeping, and it gave me something to track. I sat on my bunk and did not think about the 5 HFY cadets who had been helped out of the cafeteria by their own people and taken to the medical ring. I already knew the nature of every contact I had made, and I knew none of it was serious. Bruised pride, bruised joints. One case of the disorientation that resolves in a few hours with rest. Nothing broken, nothing permanent. I thought instead about the recording. The small Selly cadet had seen everything from the beginning. She had her device pointed at us before the first movement. In 47 days I had not spoken to a single Selly cadet directly, mostly because the two of us who had been in close proximity at the academy so far had communicated almost entirely through the expression of overwhelming social anxiety that I apparently produced in their species, for reasons I had not yet fully understood. Selly are deeply empathic. They feel the emotional register of the beings around them as a physical sensation. I had been told, gently, by one of the academy orientation counselors, a patient Thurvian named Olva, that humans in particular produce a kind of emotional signal that Selly find very difficult to interpret clearly, because human emotional architecture is unusually layered, calm on the surface and several other things running underneath. I wondered what I had felt like to her in those 10 seconds. I also wondered what she would do with the recording. I found out 4 hours later when a notification arrived on my comm link from the academy administrative office. I was being summoned to appear before the disciplinary review board at the start of the next duty cycle. The message was formal, precisely worded, and gave nothing away about which direction the review intended to go. I read it twice. Then I put my comm link on the desk and went to sleep. I was good at sleeping before difficult events. It is a skill. You either have it, or you learn it through a very uncomfortable period of not having it. I had learned it on the Martian perimeter, where the gap between a briefing and an operation was often only a few hours, and exhaustion was a luxury you could not afford. In the morning I washed, dressed in my formal cadet uniform, charcoal gray, single blue trim line at the collar that designated Terran Defense Corps exchange status, ate the meal I had prepared in my quarters from my personal stores, and walked to the review board chambers on Ring 4. The chambers were large and built in the formal style of galactic compact, administrative architecture, which means high ceilings, curved walls that focus sound toward the center of the room, and a raised platform for the reviewing body that put them approximately 6 feet above the level where the person being reviewed stood. I had read about this design. It was intentional. The spatial arrangement was meant to communicate institutional authority without anyone having to say a word. I stood in the center of the floor and looked up at the board with perfectly level attention. There were 7 of them. The board chair was an elder Thurvian named Vasek, whose species I recognized from their distinctive stacked cranial plates and the deep amber coloring that meant age and rank in their social structure. Next him sat 2 Dreven officials in academy administrative robes, a senior Vrethkai representative whose shoulder markings indicated considerable political rank, a Selly advocate in the pale gray mediation colors of their legal tradition, a human officer, Commander Patricia Aldman, the station's Terran liaison, a woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and the particular expression of someone who has seen this kind of thing before and is reserving judgment, and a younger Thurvian who appeared to be the secretary of proceedings and was managing a documentation array with all 4 of its available limbs. Across from me, on the far side of the chamber, stood 4 individuals I did not recognize but whose manner identified them immediately as legal advocates. 3 of them wore the insignia of the Vrethkai Sector Authority. The 4th wore a different marking entirely, the double spiral of the Galactic Compact External Affairs Division, which meant this had been escalated past Academy jurisdiction before the board had even convened. I noted this without changing my expression. The hearing was opened by Chair Vasek in formal Galactic Common, which the translator rendered cleanly. He outlined the matter as an incident of alleged physical aggression by Cadet Marcus Vale of the Terran Exchange Program against 5 enrolled cadets of Vrethkai citizenship, resulting in medical treatment for all 5, and a formal diplomatic complaint filed by the family of Cadet Vrek, whose father held the position of deputy governor of the 7th Rim Sector. 7th Rim Sector. I filed that away. Vrek's family was not simply wealthy and well-connected. They were politically significant in the kind of way that turned individual events into diplomatic incidents. I stood quietly and let the chair finish. Then the senior Vrethkai advocate spoke. He was precise, measured, and presented the complaint in the exact terms that legal training produces in any species. A framing of facts selected to carry maximum weight, with the inconvenient ones either absent or reshaped into something more compatible with the desired conclusion. According to his account, 5 cadets had been walking through the cafeteria engaged in normal social interaction when a human cadet had, without provocation or warning, initiated a physical assault that left all 5 requiring medical attention. The incident represented, he said, exactly the kind of behavioral instability that critics of the Terran provisional membership had long warned was inherent to a species that had, within living human memory, been conducting large-scale armed conflict against itself. He let that last part sit in the air for a moment. It was a good move, I will give him that. Chervsik asked me if I wished to respond before any evidence was reviewed. I said yes. I said, the account you have heard is incomplete. I would like the board to review the full documentation before any assessment is made. I am confident the documentation will clarify the sequence of events. The senior advocate shifted slightly. He had not been told about documentation. I looked at the Selly advocate in the pale gray robes, who was one of the board members, not the opposing advocates. She was looking at me with those large, dark Selly eyes. I said, I understand that a recording exists of the complete incident from its beginning. I would request that this board considers its review of that recording to be the first order of evidence. There was a short silence. Then Chair Vasic asked the documentation secretary to check whether any recording had been submitted to the board as evidence. The secretary, working quickly across its 4-limb documentation array, produced the answer in under a minute. A recording had been submitted. It had been filed at 03:12 station time that morning, approximately 2 hours after I had gone to sleep. It had been submitted anonymously from a cadet communication terminal, but tagged with the appropriate evidentiary flagging codes that marked it as relevant to the board proceedings. Someone had known exactly how to submit it properly, which meant someone had looked up the procedure and done it carefully. I did not look surprised because I was not surprised. The recording played on the chamber display array above us. It was steady and well framed for something shot on a personal device by shaking hands. It showed the full sequence, Vrek's casual approach, the deliberate sweep of the arm that cleared my tray, the laughter, the movement toward my table, the placement of the claw on my shoulder, the word in rough dialect that the translator rendered with uncomfortable clarity, and then, every second of the 10 that followed. The chamber was very quiet during the playback. When it ended, Chair Vasic sat for a moment with his stacked cranial plates, angled slightly downward in the Thurvian expression of careful consideration. Then he looked at the senior Vrethkai advocate. He said, in the precise formal tone that senior administrators use when they are being polite while also being completely clear, I would like the record to note that the submitted evidence presents a sequence of events materially different from the account provided. I would like the legal representatives of the complainants to advise the board whether they wish to revise their formal statement. The advocate said nothing for a long moment. Then he said they would require a consultation before proceeding. Chair Vasic said that was acceptable, and suspended the proceedings for 1 hour. In the gap, Commander Aldman, the Terran liaison, walked down from the board platform and came to stand beside me. She was not required to do this. She did it anyway. She was a small woman with very steady eyes, and she looked at me for a moment before speaking. She said, "You knew about the recording before you walked in here." It was not a question. I said, "I thought it was likely." She said, "You slept last night?" I said, "Yes." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then she said, "Good," and went back to her seat. When the hearing resumed, the senior advocate informed the board that in light of the submitted evidence, the complainant party wished to revise its formal account. The word provocation was quietly removed from the description of the incident. The phrase alleged physical aggression was adjusted to physical response to provocation. The request for Marcus Vale's expulsion was withdrawn. The request for a diplomatic incident report against the Terran exchange program was, after a further 10 minutes of private consultation, also withdrawn. What remained was a formal note of the incident in the Academy record, with no disciplinary action attached. Chair Vasic added a secondary note, filed under his own authority, citing the right of all enrolled cadets to self-defense as documented in the Academy Code of Conduct, Section 7, Paragraph 3. The hearing was closed. I thanked the board for their time, turned, and walked out. In the corridor outside the review chambers, I stood for a moment and let out a slow breath. Not from relief exactly. More from the particular release of tension that comes after you have held very still for a long time, and the need to hold still is finally over. A door opened behind me. I turned. It was the Selly advocate from the board, not one of the opposing representatives, the board member herself. She was slightly shorter than me, and wearing the pale gray robes, and she was looking at me with those large dark eyes and a very careful expression. She said in careful galactic common, "You should know the recording was not submitted by you or by any human cadet." I said, "I know." She said, "You know who submitted it?" I said, "I have a strong idea." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "That cadet submitted it at 3 in the morning." She looked up the correct filing procedure, completed the evidentiary flagging herself, and submitted it from a public terminal so it could not be traced back to her. She is a first-year student. I thought about the small figure near the observation wall, the shaking hands that had stopped shaking, the dark eyes that had not looked away. "What is her name?" The advocate said. "Leon." "Her name is Leon." I said her name quietly, just to myself, just to make sure I had it. The advocate gave me a small formal nod and walked away. I stood in the corridor for another moment. Outside the narrow viewport at the far end, space was doing what space always does, being enormous and indifferent and full of stars. I had come to this station as a human cadet from a planet that the rest of the compact considered a minor, provisional, barely worth noticing addition to a very old community. I had come as the soft mammal from the third rock of an unremarkable star, carrying a history that other species either did not know or found difficult to take seriously. I had spent 48 days being looked through, looked past, and, in the past 24 hours, looked at very carefully indeed. The charges against me had been quietly shelved. The 5 Vrethkai cadets were still in the medical wing. The recording existed now in the Academy's official evidence archive, and somewhere on this station, a first-year Selly cadet named Leon had stayed up until 3 in the morning to make sure the truth was on the record. I went back to my quarters. I made a cup of tea from my personal stores, real tea, brought from home, one of the 3 non-essential items I had been allowed in my kit, and sat at my small desk and looked out the narrow viewport at the slow turning of the stars. Then I opened my notes file and began writing down everything I had observed about the Academy's social structure in the past 48 hours that I had not yet recorded. There was a great deal to think about, and I had always found that thinking went better with tea. The recording spread faster than I expected, and in ways I had not predicted. I did not spread it. I had not asked anyone to share it, but the Academy communication network, which connected every cadet terminal on the station, was not a controlled system. It was an open mesh, designed for academic collaboration and interspecies communication. And like every open network in the history of information exchange, it had a very strong natural tendency to carry interesting things to places they had not originally been sent. By the end of the second day after the hearing, I was aware that cadets I had never met were looking at me in corridors with expressions I had to consciously categorize, not hostility, not quite admiration, something more careful than both, the expression of people updating a file they had previously considered closed. Humans at the Academy were a known quantity. There were files on us in the xenobiology archives, introductory cultural briefings in the first-year orientation package, and a general institutional attitude that translated roughly as an unusual species, highly variable in temperament, historically unstable but showing improvement, with certain physical and cognitive quirks that make them worth including in a small number of specialized programs. We were tolerated. We were occasionally interesting. We were not, as a rule, considered particularly notable in a military and tactical context. That assessment was being revised. I noticed it first in small things. The cadets, who had previously moved past me in corridors, with the polite non-acknowledgement that is universal to every species that has decided someone is not quite worth full social recognition, were now making actual eye contact. The Thurvian second year, who shared my morning route to the tactical wing, gave me a formal chin lower, their version of a respectful nod, that I was fairly certain he had never directed at a human cadet before. 3 cadets I did not know sent messages to my comm link asking if I was open to joining study groups for the tactical response seminar. One of them was a Vrethkai, which I noted without comment. I accepted the study group invitations, as I needed the academic support, and also because refusing them would have been a social signal I did not want to send. I declined 3 separate requests from cadets, who wanted to talk about what had happened in the cafeteria as an event. rather than as a background context for working together. I was not interested in being a story. I was interested in passing my third-year modules. The thing I had not anticipated was Commander Illith. She found me 4 days after the hearing. Not in a formal setting. She was waiting near the sparring hall on Ring 2 when I arrived for my regular individual training session, which I took 3 times a week at the quietest hour of the cycle when the hall was nearly empty. She was a Dreven, which meant she stood about a foot taller than me, and had the particular long-limbed physical structure of a species that evolved in lower gravity. Her coloring was a deep gray blue, and she had the 4 narrow, high-set eyes of her species that gave her a permanent expression of alert attention. She was the Academy's senior tactical combat instructor, which meant she had held the position long enough that cadets from 6 graduating classes spoke about her with the specific tone reserved for people who are genuinely excellent at something difficult. She was standing with her arms folded and looking at me with that 4-eyed alert attention as I came through the door. She said, "Show me." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Show you what, Commander?" She said, "What you did in the cafeteria. Walk me through it. Slowly, if you please." I set down my bag. I thought for a moment about what she was actually asking, because it was not a simple request, and it was not coming from a place of casual curiosity. Commander Illith had been conducting tactical combat instruction for longer than I had been alive. She had seen cadets from 40 different species move through her programs. She was asking me to demonstrate something she had watched on the recording and found professionally interesting, which meant I was about to have a conversation about human fighting tradition with one of the best tactical educators in the Galactic Compact. I said, "I will need you to play the role of a stationary reference point. I will do the movements at 1/10 speed." She said, "Acceptable." For the next 2 hours, I walked her through every second of those 10. Not just the movements, the reasoning behind them, the Vrethkai anatomy file and which elements I had used, the concept of targeting joint articulations rather than armored surfaces, the geometry of working inside a longer reach, the principle of using an attacker's forward momentum as a component of the response rather than trying to stop it. She listened without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise and pointed at exactly the right parts of the technique to indicate that she was not just following what I was saying but testing whether I understood it deeply enough to explain it clearly. At the end of 2 hours, she stood back and looked at me with a thoughtful expression for a long moment. Then she said, "Human ground combat history is documented in the archive. I have read the summary files. They are very long." I said, "Yes." She said, "The summary files describe roughly 12,000 years of continuous development in hand-to-hand fighting tradition, spanning multiple separate cultural lineages, most of which developed in parallel without significant cross-influence until the last several centuries." I said, "That is approximately accurate," she said, "and the core principle underlying most of those traditions, across cultures and periods and physical variations within your species, is what you have just shown me: efficiency, adaptability, using available information about an opponent's structure to identify the least defended path to the desired result." I said, "That is one way to describe it." She looked at me with all 4 eyes in a way that felt like being very carefully measured. Then she said, "I would like you to present a guest session to my advanced tactical cohort. Voluntary attendance. 1 cycle, 2 hours. You will teach what you know, and I will observe, and we will see what we learn." This was not a question, but it also was not quite an order. It was the offer of something, from someone who rarely offered things, and I understood the weight of it. I said, "Yes, Commander, I would be glad to." She gave me the Dreven affirmative, which is a brief, sharp downward tilt of the head, and left the hall. I stood in the empty sparring hall for a moment after she was gone and thought about what had just happened. In 40 days, I had gone from being the slightly inconvenient human cadet who sat near the observation window and ate his reconstituted chicken alone, to being the cadet that the most respected tactical instructor on the station had just personally invited to address her advanced class. I thought about what my commanding officer, Captain Felix Horn, had said to me once during my first posting. He had said, "The galaxy is very large and most of it has not yet formed a final opinion about what a human being actually is. Your job, in every room you walk into, is to help it form a better one, not by arguing, by being." I thought he would have found this particular week moderately satisfying. There was something else that happened in those days that I have not yet mentioned, because it was smaller and quieter than the rest, and it mattered more than most of it. On the 3rd day after the hearing, I was in the cafeteria again. Same table near the observation wall, same time. I made a point of it. Because returning to the same space without hesitation is also a kind of statement, and I preferred to make it once and clearly, rather than leave any ambiguity about whether I had been unsettled by the events of the week. About halfway through my meal, a small figure arrived at the edge of my table. I looked up. Leanne was a first-year Selly cadet. She was exactly as small as I remembered, barely 4 feet tall, pale blue skin with the faint bioluminescent flecks along her jaw that Selly display when they are experiencing heightened emotional input. She was carrying her meal tray carefully in both hands, and she was looking at me with large dark eyes of her species, which at full expression take up a remarkable proportion of a Selly face and make it essentially impossible to misread. Sincerity, she said, in very careful galactic common with a pronounced Selly accent. May I sit here? I gestured at the seat across from me. She sat down with precise care, arranged her tray, and then looked at me again. She said, I submitted the recording. I said, I know. I wanted to thank you, she said. I was frightened to do it. I want to be honest with you. I was very frightened. I looked at her for a moment. The bioluminescent flecks along her jaw were active. She was not trying to hide how she felt. Selly, I had read. Consider emotional honesty a form of respect. She was not performing vulnerability. She was offering me the truth of what the experience had cost her. I said, being frightened and doing it anyway is the specific definition of courage. The fear is what makes it count. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you knew I had the recording before the hearing, I think, but you did not ask me to submit it. You did not contact me, I said. It was not my decision to make, it was yours. She looked at me with those enormous dark eyes for a long time. Then she said very quietly, Selly are empathic. You know this, I said. I have read about it, she said. When you were sitting at your table, before it happened, before they came to your table, I could feel that you were ready, not angry. Ready. There is a difference. Most species, when they are ready for something difficult, feel it like pressure building, like heat. You felt like, she paused, searching for the right description, like water that is very still, very cold. I said nothing, she said. I have never felt that from any species before, not even the Dreven warriors. I was frightened of you at first, and then I realized that what I was feeling was not a threat. It was focus, and I thought, someone should record this, because this is the truth, and the truth should be in the record. I looked at her for a long moment. The stars outside the observation panel were doing their slow drift across the window, the same patch of sky I had been tracking for 47 days. I said, Leanne, thank you for all of it. She gave me the Selly gesture of acknowledgement, which involves placing both small hands briefly flat on the table between you. An offering of shared presence, their version of a handshake but without the contact. I returned it because I had looked it up the night before. She blinked at that. Then she smiled, which on a Selly face is a very wide and very bright expression. We ate our meals together in a comfortable silence, with the stars moving slowly past the window. And that was the beginning of the first actual friendship I made at the Galactic Fleet Academy. The 5 Vrethkai cadets were released from the medical wing over the following week, one by one, as the formal record settled into its final form, and it became clear that there would be no further proceedings. They returned to the Academy population. They returned quietly. The loud ownership of the cafeteria, the slow movement through the center tables, the particular manner of people who expect the space to rearrange itself around them. All of that was gone. I noticed them before they noticed me, which was the natural order of things given how I operate. On the day Vrek returned, he entered the cafeteria, and his eyes found my table near the observation wall, and we looked at each other for approximately 3 seconds. I gave him a short, direct nod. He looked at me for another second. Then he looked away and went to sit with his remaining friends at a table near the far wall. He did not take the center tables again, not that day, not in the weeks that followed. I did not celebrate this. It was not a victory in the sense I am most comfortable with. The most satisfying outcomes are the ones that do not require a winner and a loser. This one did. I would have preferred otherwise, but the world is not always arranged for our preferences, and you do with the situation you are given what you have the tools to do. What I had the tools to do was continue, study, train, show up, be present in every room I entered as exactly what I was, a human being, with a particular history and a particular set of capabilities, trying to learn enough to be genuinely useful in a galaxy that was still making up its mind about what we were. That felt like enough. For now, it felt like exactly enough. And then there was the letter from home that arrived at the end of that week, from my mother in Carlisle, who wrote every week without exception, regardless of the several light-minute delay in transmission, asking how I was eating and whether I had made any friends yet. Sat at my desk and wrote back. I told her I had made one. I told her I was eating fine. I told her the apple juice was still not great, but I was managing. I did not mention the cafeteria incident, because some things you do not put in letters to your mother. But I sat for a moment before I sent it and thought about everything those weeks had contained, and about Leanne with her shaking hands that had stopped shaking, and about Commander Illith wanting to know how a human body had processed those 10 seconds, and about the quiet way the center tables in the cafeteria had rearranged themselves without anyone officially saying anything. And I thought about what Captain Horn had told me. The galaxy is still making up its mind about what a human being is. Your job is to help it form a better one. I sent the letter. The transmission delay would carry it home in about 6 minutes and 23 seconds, which by my calculation would reach Carlisle somewhere around mid-morning. My mother would read it with her coffee and write back before noon. She always did. The session with Commander Illith's advanced tactical cohort was scheduled for the 14th day after the cafeteria incident, on a Thursday afternoon in the main sparring complex on Ring 2. I spent 3 days preparing, not because I was nervous. I was not nervous in the way that anticipation of difficult things usually produces nervousness. I was thorough, in the way that I am always thorough when something matters. I wrote out a full framework for the 2 hours, organized it by concept rather than technique, because techniques without underlying principles are just a collection of movements that only work in the specific circumstances they were practiced for. And I wanted this cohort to take away something more durable than a set of moves they had seen a human demonstrate once. The framework I built was based on 3 ideas that I had been thinking about since my first posting with the Defense Corps. The first was that every physical confrontation is an information problem before it is a physical one. The second was that the most consistent advantage in any such confrontation comes from accurate understanding of your own capabilities and your opponent's vulnerabilities, not from superior raw force. The third was that the instinct to create distance from a threat, to back away, is almost always the wrong choice when someone has already committed to aggression, because distance gives an attacker time to correct and adjust, and the goal is to deny them exactly that. These were not new ideas. Versions of them existed in the combat traditions of multiple species, but the specific architecture of how humans had developed and refined them, across 12,000 years and dozens of parallel cultural traditions on a single small planet, had produced a body of practical knowledge that was unusual in the compact for its sheer depth and diversity. We had not had the benefit of peaceful planetary unification under a single governing structure for most of our history. We had fought each other, constantly and inventively and at great cost. And out of that terrible history we had built something that, from a purely technical standpoint, was remarkable. I had never thought about this as something to be proud of. It was simply what it was. But standing in the sparring hall on Ring 2, facing 32 cadets from 11 different species, I thought about it more carefully than I had before. Illith's advanced tactical cohort were not first years. They were the students who had tested into the highest level combat training track, which at the academy meant they represented the top 12% of enrolled cadets across all species in physical and tactical capability. They ranged in size from a Dreven cadet who stood nearly 9 feet tall to a Selly cadet, not Leon, a different one, older and with a particular quiet focus I was beginning to recognize as characteristic of their species' combat practitioners, who was barely taller than a human child. They looked at me with varying expressions. Some were openly curious. Some were professionally neutral in the manner of people who have been well trained to reserve judgment until they have sufficient information. A few were something I can only describe as carefully interested, which is the expression I most appreciate in a room, because it means the person is actually paying attention. One of them was a Vrethkai. He was standing near the back of the group, not one of the 5 from the cafeteria. A different cadet, younger, with the lighter coloring of a first-year student and the shoulder marking of the standard academy intake, rather than anything politically significant. He was watching me with his wide lateral vision, and there was something in his posture, a very slight forward lean that on a Vrethkai indicates attentive interest rather than aggressive positioning, that I noted and filed. Commander Illith was seated in the observation tier to my left. She had told me before the session began that she would not intervene, instruct, or comment. She was there to observe. The session was mine to conduct. I stood in the center of the floor and looked at the cohort for a moment. Then I said, I am going to start by asking you to forget everything you think you know about what happened in the cafeteria 2 weeks ago. What happened there is not what we are going to talk about today. We are going to talk about why it could happen. And by the end of this session, Every one of you should be able to answer that question in terms that apply to your own species and your own situation, not just mine. I saw a few expressions shift. That was the right shift, from watching a performance to actually listening. I said, every one of you came into this hall today because you are good at something physical. You are faster than average, or stronger, or more perceptive, or better at processing threat information under pressure. That is why you are in this track. That is real and it is worth having. But I want to propose to you that the most important thing that will determine the outcome of any genuine physical confrontation is not the attribute that makes you strong. It is the attribute that keeps you from being wrong. Silence. Good, I said. When I was 19 years old and posted to the Martian perimeter, I was in a 2-person patrol unit that walked into an ambush set by a group of insurgents who were significantly larger, better armed, and higher in number than us. We survived that ambush, not because we were stronger, because in the 3 seconds between identifying that we were in a bad situation and choosing a direction, my partner and I had already processed enough accurate information about the space we were in to select the only viable exit. I paused. 3 seconds. Every other quality we had was meaningless if those 3 seconds produced the wrong answer. Everything I am going to show you today is about building the capacity to use those 3 seconds better. The next hour and 40 minutes were the most engaged I had felt inside a classroom setting since arriving at the academy. The cohort asked questions that were sharp and specific and built on each other, rather than circling the same surface observations. The Draven cadet had a particular gift for identifying the structural principles behind each demonstration and articulating them in the shared language with a precision that would have served him well in any formal academic setting. The silly combat practitioner at the back asked almost nothing but moved to the front of the group during every physical demonstration and watched with a quality of attention that I understood as the highest form of compliment her species offered in a learning context. And the young Vrethkai cadet at the back edge of the group stayed where he was for the first hour, listening with that careful forward lean. In the second hour, when I invited anyone who wanted to participate in a live demonstration of the close-range geometry principle to come forward, he was the first one to move. His name was Keth. He told me this when he took his position across from me on the demonstration floor, with a directness that I appreciated. He said his name and his year and his specialization track, tactical navigation, and then he said, I understand the principle you described. I want to feel whether my anatomy responds to it the way you described. I said, thank you, Keth. That is exactly the right reason to volunteer. We worked through the demonstration slowly, at a fraction of live speed, and I talked the cohort through every element of it in real time. Keth was a good partner for this. He did not tense against the movements or try to resist them at a speed that would have made the demonstration incoherent. He moved at the pace that the demonstration required, and when I indicated the joint articulation point that I had identified in the cafeteria as a primary target, he reached down and touched it himself, feeling the membrane, understanding with his own hand what I had understood from a file. He straightened up and looked at me. He said, that is a significant vulnerability. I said, yes. He said, is it documented in the Academy's current combat training files for Vrethkai cadets? I said, not in the detail it deserves. He looked at me for another moment. Then he said, in the very straightforward manner of someone who has decided to say something and is going to say it completely. The 5 cadets who were in the cafeteria are from families with significant political standing. I am not. I want you to know that I find what happened in that cafeteria, the entire sequence, to be a matter of record that reflects poorly on those 5 cadets and not on you. I say this not as a diplomatic statement. I say it because it is accurate. The hall was very quiet. I looked at Keth for a moment. He was a first-year student. He was standing in front of 31 other cadets and the most respected tactical instructor on the station, and he had just said something that was politically risky and personally honest, and he had said it directly and clearly without performance. I said, I appreciate that. Thank you. He gave me the Vrethkai acknowledgement, both primary claws briefly open, head tilted to a neutral position, and stepped back to the edge of the group. I resumed the session. At the end of the 2 hours, Commander Illith came down from the observation tier. The cohort waited. She stood at the edge of the floor and looked at me for a moment with those 4 narrow, high-set eyes. Then she said to the cohort, what Cadet Vale has shown you today is available to every one of you, regardless of species or physical architecture. The specific techniques transfer differently by body type. The underlying principle does not. You will see these concepts appear in the next 4 sessions of the advanced track, and I will expect you to demonstrate that you have absorbed them. She paused. You are dismissed. The cohort dispersed. Commander Illith did not move. She looked at me and said, second session, 3 weeks. It was not a question, I said. Yes, Commander. She left. I gathered my notes and stood in the emptying hall for a moment. 3 weeks. There was a great deal to prepare. I was looking forward to it. Graduation at the Galactic Fleet Academy does not resemble graduation ceremonies on Earth in any way that I could comfortably map onto familiar experience. There is no open outdoor space because the station does not have one. There is no throwing of hats because the Academy does not issue hats, and also because several enrolled species do not have heads shaped accommodate them. There is no single streaming of graduates walking across a stage, because a ceremony that needed to include the full physical diversity of 40 species would require a stage that no ring of the station could accommodate at its current configuration. What happens instead is the assembled commendation in the largest of the Academy's formal halls on Ring 1, which is where the administrative functions of the station concentrate and where the architecture is at its most deliberately impressive. The hall can seat approximately 3,000. For the graduation cycle that included my cohort, it was full. I had spent 3 years at the Academy by that point. 3 years is a long time, and a great deal had changed. And I am aware that the story I am telling has covered that entire period in the way that any personal account covers long time rather imperfectly, by selecting the moments that illuminate the shape of the whole, rather than recording every day. So let me say what the shape of those 3 years looked like, briefly, before the ceremony itself. Commander Illith's second session became a series. By the end of my second year, I was co-instructing alongside her for 1 session per month. She did not make a large announcement about this, or frame it in any formal institutional language. She simply adjusted the session listing to include my name, and when other cadets asked about it, she said, "He knows things I do not, and learning from people who know things you do not is the function of a functioning mind." This was, I came to understand, the highest form of professional compliment she was capable of offering, and she offered it without ceremony or inflation, which made it land harder than it might have otherwise. Leanne and I remained close. She was in her 3rd year when I was in my 2nd, and she had by that time developed into one of the most respected academic voices in the xenobiology department, partly because of her specific gifts as a Celi empath in interspecies observation contexts, and partly because she had a mind that was genuinely exceptional and applied itself to every problem with a quality of careful thoroughness that I recognized and respected. She sat with me in the cafeteria every meal cycle. We were both free. We had our own table by then. Other cadets joined us sometimes. Keth, from the 2nd sparring session onward. Once he transferred to the tactical specialization track in his 2nd year. A Dreven cadet named Orla, who had been in the advanced cohort and who communicated almost entirely in precise technical observations that I found restful after a heavy day. Owen Marsh, when his engineering workload allowed it, who ate with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had been surviving on nutrient blocks in the workshop bay and found an actual meal to be a profound emotional experience. It became, without any formal declaration, a table. The 5 Vrethkai cadets completed their own years. Vrek left at the end of his 3rd year to take a position in the sector governor's administrative structure, as had presumably always been his intended path regardless of the academy. His 4 companions went various directions. I watched them go without particular feeling either way. What had happened between us had happened. It was in the record. I did not carry it further than that. Keth graduated 1 cycle ahead of me, top of his navigation track, and received a deployment posting to the Forward Exploration Division that I knew, from what he had told me about his goals, was exactly where he had always wanted to be. On the night before he left, he came to the cafeteria at my table time, sat down without ceremony, and said, "I will send you my sector logs if the division allows transmission sharing. You will find the navigation data interesting." I said I looked forward to reading them. He gave me the dual claw opening, head tilt neutral. I returned it perfectly. I had been practicing for 3 years. He smiled. Vrethkai smiles are an unusual thing when you are not used to them, involving the secondary mandibles and a specific relaxation of the primary claw position that takes time to read correctly. By that point I could read it as clearly as I read a human smile. He left the next morning, which brings me to the assembled commendation of my graduating cycle, in the largest hall on Ring 1, where 3,000 seats were filled, and the graduating address was being given by the highest scoring cadet of the combined tactical and command track. That was me. I not sought this. I want to be clear about that. The nomination process for the graduating address speaker is conducted by the board. and the criteria are academic performance, conduct record, and what the formal documentation calls demonstrated contribution to the institutional learning environment, which is a formal way of saying, did this person add something to this place beyond their own progress? I had not done any of those things with the graduation address in mind. I had done them because they were the right things to do and because doing less than your full capability in any situation is a choice that you live with in ways that accumulate over time. But I stood at the podium in that enormous hall and looked out at 3,000 faces, cadets and instructors and administrative staff, and the visiting representatives of member species and the small delegation from the Terran Compact Office who had apparently decided this was worth attending, and I felt for just a moment the full weight of where I was standing. A cadet from Carlisle, a Defense Corps veteran, a human being on a space station 300,000 kilometers above a planet he still could not pronounce the name of, standing at the podium of the Galactic Fleet Academy, giving the graduating address. My mother was going to hear about this. I had already decided I was going to call her the moment the ceremony was over, and she was going to say something specific that I could not fully predict, but that I knew would involve the phrase I always knew, delivered in the exact Northern English tone that somehow manages to be both completely understated and absolutely enormous at the same time. I straightened my uniform, I looked at the hall, and I did not talk about the cafeteria. That was the first decision I had made when I started drafting the address, and I held to it. The cafeteria was not the point. It had never been the point. It was a single event from a single afternoon 3 years ago, and whatever people remembered about it, I did not want the last thing I said at this academy to be about a fight. I talked about Earth. I talked about what it means to come from a planet that nearly ended itself several times before it reached the stars. Not as a confession or an apology, as a statement of record. Humans made extraordinary mistakes across a very long history. We fought each other over resources, over beliefs, over the specific shapes of lines drawn on maps. We polluted the air we breathed and the water we drank, and the soil we grew food in. We built weapons capable of ending all complex life on our planet, and then lived for generations under the specific daily weight of knowing those weapons existed. We were not a species that arrived at space travel because we had resolved our nature. We arrived because we were still here, which is a different thing entirely, I said. Being still here is not the same as being good, but it is the necessary condition for becoming better. Every generation of humans that did not give up on the project of trying to be better than the previous one carried that possibility forward. Not heroically, often not even consciously, just by surviving and continuing and passing something forward to the next group of people who had to figure out what to do with the world they had been handed. I said, I came to this academy because the Terran Compact decided that offering a cadet exchange program was the next step in demonstrating that we were worth knowing. I leave this academy because I believe that is true, not because humans are stronger or smarter or more capable than the other species represented in this hall. We are not, in most individual metrics, superior to most of you. What we are, as far as I can tell after 3 years of studying alongside you and training alongside you and eating mediocre, reconstituted food alongside you, is persistently, stubbornly, inconveniently unwilling to accept that the current state of things is the final state of things. We carry an instinct toward improvement that is sometimes catastrophic in its application and occasionally remarkable in its outcomes. I said, this galaxy is very large and most of what it contains has not yet been encountered, understood, or appreciated. The Academy prepares us to go and do the encountering and understanding and appreciating, which is a task that will require, in my experience, the specific capabilities of every species represented here, not as complementary elements in a ranked hierarchy, as genuine collaborators in a project that is larger than any of us. I paused. I looked out at the hall. 3,000 faces. 40 species said. I want to acknowledge one person before I close. She is in this hall today, graduating from the xenobiology track. She is a Selly cadet named Leon, and in my first year at this academy, she did something that required more courage than anything I did in the cafeteria 3 years ago. She stayed in a difficult room, kept her eyes open, documented the truth, and then got up at 3 in the morning and made sure it was on the record. I was asked to speak here today because the board said I contributed something to this institution. Whatever I contributed, she contributed something more important. She contributed accuracy. She contributed honesty at a personal cost. And the only reason any of the rest of what happened after that day went in the right direction is because she decided the truth was worth the effort of recording it. I looked at the section of the hall where the xenobiology graduates were seated. Leon was looking at me with her enormous dark eyes, and the bioluminescent flecks along her jaw were active and very bright. And she was not crying, because Selly do not cry in the way humans do, but there was an expression on her face that, in 3 years, I had learned to read as clearly as I read any human expression, and it meant, I see you and I am glad we are here and this matters. I gave her a small nod. I looked back at the full hall. I said, 3 years ago, someone spilled my lunch. It seems like a small thing to have mattered as much as it did. But nothing happens in isolation. Everything is connected to what surrounds it. I was in that cafeteria. Leon was in that cafeteria. The recording exists. You are all here now. Small moments are the material from which everything larger is built. I paused for the last time. Thank you for 3 years that I will spend the rest of my life thinking about. I stepped back from the podium. The hall was quiet for approximately 3 seconds, which in a space that large and that full is an unusual and very specific kind of quiet, the kind that is not the absence of response but the gathering of it. And then it was not quiet at all. After the ceremony, in the corridor outside the hall, with the noise of several hundred simultaneous graduation conversations echoing from every direction, I found a quieter alcove near a viewport and called my mother. She answered on the second signal, which meant she had been waiting. I told her it had gone well. She said, I know. I watched the transmission. The delay was terrible, but I heard every word. I said, You watched the transmission? She said. Commander Aldman arranged it. She sent me the access code 2 days ago. She said you would probably not think to tell me it was being broadcast, and she wanted to make sure I did not miss it. I thought about Commander Aldman, with her short gray hair, and her expression of reserved judgment that had turned, over 3 years, into something that felt more like quiet, steady support. Then I thought about her taking the time to contact a woman in Carlisle and send her an access code. Without saying anything to me about it, I said, I will have to thank her. My mother said, she sounds lovely. I sent her a message already. I laughed. It was a proper laugh, the kind that catches you slightly off guard with how good it feels. My mother always had that effect. She said, Are you eating properly? I said, The apple juice is still not great. She said, Come home soon. I said, I will. After the call, I stood at the viewport for a moment. The stars were doing what stars do, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. The station's rotation carried the familiar strip of sky across the window. I had watched it for 3 years. I knew its pace the way I knew my own heartbeat. Later that evening, there was a gathering in the common area of the graduating wing, informal and unscheduled. The kind of thing that assembles itself naturally when a large group of people finish something significant together and are not yet ready to go back to their rooms and be alone with the end of it. I went. Leanne was there, and Orla and Owen Marsh, who had apparently saved an entirely contraband bottle of something from his engineering supplies that he was extremely vague about the origins of, and that turned out to taste surprisingly acceptable in small amounts. At some point in the evening, I looked across the room and saw a familiar figure standing near the far wall. He had arrived quietly and was holding a small drink container, and looking around the room with the careful, assessing attention that I recognized as the Vrethkai habit of reading a social space before committing to a position within it. He was in civilian clothes rather than cadet uniform, which meant he had already processed out of the academy population. It was Keth. He had come back for the ceremony from his deployment posting, which I later learned he had requested leave for specifically, and which his division had approved without making much of it. He crossed the room when he saw me looking at him. He stood across from me and we looked at each other for a moment. He said, Your address was good. I said, Thank you for coming back. He said, I told my navigation partner about the 3rd session from your co-instruction series, the one on the pressure-based decision model. She is applying it to navigation scenario training. It works. I said, That is very good to hear. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to say something that I have been thinking about since my first year when I came to your sparring session. I waited. He said, My species has a long formal history, political structures that are many generations deep. There are things that are expected of Vrethkai who carry the markings I carry, in terms of what we consider, who we associate with, what we treat as worth our time. I was taught that humans were a footnote, a new and not particularly relevant addition to a very old story. He paused. The secondary mandibles shifted in a way that I could now read as the precursor to a thought being completed. He said, You are not a footnote. I want that stated clearly. For the record, I said, Noted. Thank you, Keth. He gave me the dual claw opening, head tilt neutral. I returned it. We had been exchanging that greeting for 2 years, and it had never felt like a performance. He stayed at the gathering for another hour. He left before midnight, Carlisle time, which is the clock I still keep in my head regardless of how many different time systems the station operates on. Later, much later, after Leanne had fallen asleep in a chair near the window in the way that Selly do when they are in a space that feels safe, and Orla was deep in a technical conversation with two Dreven cadets about propulsion models, and Owen Marsh was teaching a small group of non-human cadets the rules of a card game from home, that they were all finding simultaneously confusing and entertaining, I went and sat near the viewport with a last cup of tea from my personal stores and looked out at the stars. 3 years. I thought about the first day, the small room, the viewport with the strip of sky I had started timing on the second night because I could not sleep. I thought about the cafeteria, the tray, the 10 seconds, the hearing. Leanne at 3 in the morning, looking up filing procedures on a public terminal. Because she had decided the truth was worth the effort of making sure it landed in the right place. Commander Illith saying, "Show me." Keth stepping forward to volunteer for a demonstration in a hall full of people watching him. The graduation address in the full hall. I thought about what Captain Horn had said. The galaxy is still making up its mind about what a human being is. Your job is to help it form a better one. I thought, I do not know if I helped. I do not know if 3 years and one fight in a cafeteria and a series of sparring sessions and a graduation speech moves a galaxy's opinion by any measurable amount. The galaxy is very large. It has been forming opinions about species for a long time, and those opinions are not easily shifted. But Leanne was here. Keth was here. Orla and Owen and Commander Aldman, and even, somewhere on the other side of a long transmission delay, my mother who had watched the ceremony and sent a message to a person she had never met because that person had been kind. Small moments are the material from which everything larger is built. I drank my tea. Outside the viewport, the stars were exactly where they had always been. I picked up my comlink and wrote a message to my mother. It said, "I think they are starting to get it, Mum. It just took a spilled lunch." I looked at it for a moment. Then I sent it. The transmission would take 6 minutes and 23 seconds to reach Carlisle. She would read it in the morning with her coffee. She would know what I meant.